Well, hello again, everybody. This is John Norris at Trading Perspectives. As always, we have our good friend, Sam Clement. Sam, say hello.
John, how are you doing?
Sam, I'm doing fantastic. I'm not filled with a whole bunch of angst at this time of year. My heart is light. I'm feeling good about things. Unlike a lot of voters over in the European Union and throughout Europe in general.
A lot of changes going on in the political space.
When I mentioned Europe, but if I failed to mention Argentina, it seems as though, I don't know, I've already used the word angst, but I'm going to use it again. It seems as though angst is pouring out all over the place. What's going on?
And it seems like it's kind of ramped up a little, too. We kind of talked about this probably 6 months to a year or so ago, and it wasn't it may have been argued to be a one-time event, kind of one-off of a complete
I think we were talking about Georgia Meloni.
Yep. And then we've gotten some even, maybe not bigger, but just more and more examples, it feels like, of the political spectrum in different countries just completely flip-flopping. We saw it in the Netherlands, the Dutch, and we've seen it, I guess, more publicly with Argentina lately.
Well, it's not just the Dutch. Surprise win there. The Argentinian win, big surprise there. Germany shifting a little bit to the right after being kind of hard left for a while. Poland recently had a plebiscite, and it went from hard right to only modestly hard right or moderately hard right, kind of going from MAGA to Nelson Rockefeller Republicans, that sort of type deal. But you have Hungary, you have some other states out there that have elected people that are far more conservative or far more right-leaning, more nationalist, if you will, than what their predecessors had been. Obviously, we know what's going on down in Italy with Meloni, and it just kind of begs the question, is globalism dying? And if so, what's the cause for it?
Well, I think it's weak economies, I think, is the easy answer. Almost, I think no matter what, if it was far right and then you have an extremely weak economy, you start to see things go the opposite direction. When times are tough and you see your government focusing on maybe the wrong issues and things just getting worse and digging yourself into a hole, like Argentina has for at least several decades.
ever since the 50s, really.
Yeah. At some point, the dam kind of breaks in terms of what you're willing to put up with and what you're willing to throw a flyer at, maybe, or throw darts at, and see if something so different maybe sticks a little bit more. And I think, lastly, you're seeing people, the nationalistic part you pointed at, when countries are in kind of economic turmoil, or at least not as great as they should be, and you see your government focusing on other countries, that starts to rub people wrong, I think.
Well, it starts to rub people the wrong way. And it's not just, the sluggish economy that a lot of Europe, and particularly, Argentina down in South America, it's experienced for some time. It's the high prices, and it's, I don't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel. We just keep on just going from to. And if I'm the average Frenchman, average Dutchman, average German, I'm going, all right, I hear you. You've been selling this to me for a while. I need to see some results. Guys, I'm not seeing results. And I mentioned France, and while Macron still has, firm grip on power over there, recent polls suggest that maybe Le Pen would win by 8 points if they were to hold the election tomorrow, but they don't have to hold it until 2027 at the latest. So when you take a look at some of these places, it's kind of like going, people are saying, okay, I bought your argument for a while, but I'm also really kind of in it for me. And I'm not seeing me get ahead. And at the same time, I'm not getting ahead. All of a sudden, you have all of these immigrants show up out of the blue. I was reading some crazy numbers for the UK and some other places. Biggest surge in immigration in a decade. And it's something like over the last year, the UK has let in more legal immigrants than they did in the first 1,500 years of its existence. So some crazy number. So if I'm struggling to make ends meet, or if I'm struggling to put haggis on the table, there you go. Blood sausage. If I'm struggling to have baked beans for breakfast, all that type of stuff, and I see my government continuing to pour money into letting these people in, I can see how populism, how maybe nationalism starts to percolate a little bit.
And it's the two viewpoints of, getting your economy to grow means a bigger pie as a whole versus, we have this same pie and I'm just getting a smaller piece of it. And I think when your economy is really stagnant and you're seeing that pie that not really growing.
The pie doesn't seem to be growing.
And your slice seems to be getting smaller. You eventually want to, kind of revert to the airlines telling you to put your own oxygen mask on first before helping other people.
Well, they always say that, and then they always say, don't freak out if the bag doesn't inflate. Well, guess what?
You're freaking out.
I'm freaking out, and then you can kind of say that the bag doesn't seem to be inflating in a lot of these places. Take a look at the UK economic growth. Take a look, really, southern economies, southern European economies, and it's just really, I mentioned already, the light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't appear to be there, but the migrants keep on coming because no matter how bad things might seem in Italy to an Italian, man, it's nirvana. It's Eden compared to people from Libya or Central Africa or even Albania, where the Italians just get a ton of migrants. They recently had to sign a deal with them, as a matter of fact, kind of like what we've signed with Mexico in the past. For all the problems the Europeans think that they have, it's still a very attractive place for a lot of people. Similar to here in the United States. I mean, it's like we're sitting here struggling, all this inflation and median household income went down last year or the year before that. They haven't calculated. In any event, a lot of people don't think they're getting ahead. You take a look at real clear politics, take a look at direction of the country, all that stuff. People think we're going to hell in a handbasket. And yet we see all these people from all over the world coming up through our southern borders, because no matter how bad we think it is here, no matter how much the American dream is dissipated, it's still nirvana to most.
Exactly. It's hard to blame people for wanting to come to places with much greater opportunity. And I don't think that's really where people get the issues from. I think it's one, focusing on legal versus illegal and crime and drugs and what have you going across different borders. I think that tends to be the bigger focus. I don't think anyone's saying, I don't get why they would want to come here. I mean, the EU as a whole and the U.S. are still, by all estimations, the best place to live.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really any debate about that. The G7 countries are where you would want to live.
Some people in New Zealand or some people down in Australia, they might take. They might take.
Okay, we'll include them as well.
Okay,
but
the G9.
It's just harder to migrate to Australia, I guess.
Yeah, much harder.
But it's just a matter of I think the EU as a whole, the immigration portion of it has become such a focal point. I mean, we saw Wilder, or however you pronounce it, the new candidate in the Netherlands, calling for a Nexit, as he called it. Netherlands exiting.
That's never going to happen.
No. But that sentiment, I think, is so interesting. You're seeing it from that sentiment in almost all these European countries, at least to some extent, and it seems to be boiling over.
I mean, I could imagine hearing that out of some of the Eastern European countries, even in Italy, them to get kind of hot-headed at times from their reputation and history. But that was kind of shocking to hear from the Dutch, the old Nexit, because they've been internationalists ever since, 15th, 16th century. But kind of going back to these people these areas being a great place to live. I think you're starting to see this kind of boil over in Europe a little bit more, because a lot of, from what I have read, and I could be wrong, but from what I have read, BBC, other websites, Le Monde, it seems as though a lot of the people coming up into these areas aren't necessarily aspiring to be Frenchmen, aren't necessarily aspiring to be Italians or Germans. They're aspiring to live in these countries, but still hold on to their old culture, their old way of doing things, their language, their schools, all that type of stuff, just living someplace else. And for a while, that works. But when all of a sudden you start to see economic activity or economic opportunities start to slow, and you're starting to see more of a sort of a ghetto type structure, all of a sudden people think hey, maybe this isn't working. I was happy to have you come here if you wanted to come in here, you wanted to speak French, eat croissants, and go to mass twice a year, However, you came here and you're still living the same life you were doing down in Algeria, and I'm not cool with that.
And there's a balancing act, too. The U.S. has always been called the melting pot, and I think for a long time we've done a good job of assimilating people into U.S. culture while also being able to retain their origin. And I think we've done a good job of celebrating that.
I would say we've done a better job than most.
Yes. But there is a balancing act. But you're right. It's tough when you're not seeing. You're just seen this complete divide in areas in your country?
Well, I mean, kind of interestingly enough, it was some weeks ago I made a presentation to a group of the shall remain nameless here in Birmingham. Someone asked me a question about immigration. It's almost an unfair thing. It's way too political. And I said what I've always said. Immigration's always been a net positive for the United States.
Yeah.
I said what I think is frustrating some people on some spot in the spectrum of, in terms of political thought, is that people are coming here, and what I just mentioned about largely Arabs and France, you could say, some people would say the same about the Central Americans and South Americans that are coming up now. They're not necessarily trying to assimilate to the same degree that maybe you could argue the Irish and some others did when they came over in the 19th century. Blanket statement may be unfair, and I did have one person in the room take significant issue with me on that. A gentleman of Hispanic origin saying it's not really, assimilation is not the key. It's to come here and live in the United States. And I didn't feel like battling with him. I go, this culture is only going to work if we all try to assimilate. Now, by assimilate, that doesn't mean I tell you you've got to eat casseroles. You don't have to eat Kraft macaroni and cheese. You don't have to eat white mashed potatoes and all those other sort of waspy type foods. You don't have to do that. You don't have to listen to Van Halen. You don't have to listen to Sinatra. However, it's coming and being indoctrinated in American culture, the American way, what it means to be an American
Pride to
thought.
be an American.
And that's what I mean by assimilation. If you take a look at, things that have been a net positive, it's just like, I mean, my gosh, what we have gained from our society, from all the waves of immigration that we have had, it's truly unique. And just the culture that we have, the food that we have, the music that we have, is a melange of really just so many different cultures. So we have done a better job than I would say the Europeans have, who have always been very protective of their culture. The French in particular, Germans to a degree, all of them been very, very protective of their culture. Now they're starting to see not only slower economic growth, but people coming in that want to live there but maybe not adopt the culture. And that's not surprising why you're starting to see nationalistic, arguably right-wing sort of type parties get to be more and more popular.
So what does this mean for the EU then? It's funny when we talked
we
about
the
the fear of what the dollar destabilization and what's going to take over as the world's reserve currency, and we kind of laid it out that there really wasn't a good option, but gun to your head, the euro was probably the second best option.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still not a good option, but gun to your head, that's probably the second best option.
Well, you probably wouldn't have to go that far with a gun to my head.
Knife
to the throat or something like that. It's clearly the second best option. But as you know, as I've said in the past, that I'm not confident that the Eurozone is going to be in existence in the same form in 10 years.
And we said that a couple of years ago at least. And then you see more and more countries that really have been saved by the EU to a certain extent now saying they're not big fans of it.
Yeah.
That you're going down the full spectrum of countries that are in it. Britain kind of led the way. It made, I guess, a little sense intuitively to some people, clearly enough to vote for it.
Yeah.
But then you're going down the ladder of countries that have been benefactors of the EU, getting tired of it.
In my estimation, this is me speaking as an American and not really perhaps understanding all the sensibilities or the politics involved therein. The goal of the EU is to have people think of themselves as European first, and their own nation or own nationality second. I think for a while that can work, but when times get tough, when the Russians are knocking on your door, hey, it's great to have European friends, but I'm a Pole first.
Yeah.
If I live in Hungary, I speak Magyar. I'm an Italian. I speak Italian. I don't have that much in common with the Finns.
It's very different than the U.S. looking at a country versus states. And these are countries with heritage that goes back literally thousands of years. Thousands of years, 5, 10, 20 times longer than the U.S. has even been a country. So it's hard to compare and hard to kind of group those cultures that are so, polar opposite in a lot of ways. Europe's not a big place by landmass in terms of how many massively
particularly Western Europe.
Yes.
You take away European Russia, and what's the landmass size? Roughly the size of U.S. and a little bit of Canada. It's maybe a little bit bigger than that, but we're still talking about not a huge area.
And then these are countries that share borders with cultures that are so polar opposite.
Well, speak differently, eat
Austrians,
different things.
Italians, French, all right there.
Eat different foods. All of it. So completely different cultures, and to expect that not to percolate just because we have decided to have this Eurozone or European Union, a lot of decisions made out of Brussels, for that not to come back to the forefront, that someone sitting in Gdansk or Warsaw is going to go, I'm Polish.
Yeah.
Or someone sitting in Salerno going, well, I'm Italian. I'm really Sicilian, but I'm Italian. I'm Italian. Or someone in Madrid going, I'm Spanish. People in Portuguese will say, I'm not Spanish. I'm Portuguese. Please don't ever say I'm Spanish and all that stuff. It's kind of that deal to expect people to not kind of revert back to that when that's what you've really hit home with it. We're talking centuries.
It's like 1%.
Yeah, I guess like centuries of that being your blood's line's identity.
Yeah.
You're expecting that to be thrown out the window because the elites in Brussels say you shouldn't think that way any longer. And that's just not realistic.
It's not realistic. It's not sustainable. It's kind of like, the more crises something like that goes through, surviving 2008 and, what Greece has struggled through and a lot of these countries have struggled through. But if you just keep butting your head against the wall trying to, put a square peg in a round hole, it's not.
No, I think we are not trading perspectives. I think we're in complete agreement, probably thinking way too much like Americans, which frankly it's in our bloodline. Thinking as Americans in these situations, particularly in Europe, I don't see how that gets turned around absent some sort of major economic miracle or something like that. I don't think this is the end of it. I don't think the recent election in the Netherlands is the end of the recent elections in Germany. I think people are going to start reverting and identifying far more and more with their historical culture and their historical nationality. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In my estimation. It's not necessarily a bad thing. However, World War I and World War II left a huge scar on the European psyche that I don't know if it could ever fully be healed. But it's okay to admit that you're Polish. It's okay to admit that you're Italian. It's okay to be proud to be an American.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. And for some reason, we seem to be being taught or at least suggested that that's uncool to be patriotic or to have nationalistic pride. Now, I think what's going on down in Argentina is a little bit different than what's going on in Europe in terms of...
This is one country that's been an economic juggernaut in terms of...
Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an expression, he was as rich as an Argentinian or Argentine. Argentina was a much bigger player in global events back in the day. Huge influx of European immigrants went there and made Argentina, the most. I think Buenos Aires is the most European capital in the world outside of Europe, and probably arguably even more European than some European capitals. The Peronists down there have mismanaged that country's economy disastrously for 50, 60, 70 years, to the point where it is a middle-income sort of type state. It has so much potential. It has a very well-trained workforce, natural reserves, and they just squander it. I'm sorry to anyone that's from Argentina listening to it. That's what one person's opinion in Central Alabama is on your economy.
Well, clearly enough people agree.
Well, clearly, but I would imagine after so many problems, I think people in Argentina, at least as is evidenced by this most recent election, have said, we've got to try something different.
Yeah. Yep.
Again,
like I said, it's kind of self-evident that enough people agreed to swing so polar opposite.
So when is this going to change around the world? I think we've seen it a little bit with Modi in India. His party is far more nationalistic than maybe the Congress, I think. Certainly seeing it with Xi, President Xi. Even seeing it to a degree with the Japanese a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I think this is a trend going on around the world, and this is a Pandora's box that once it's been opened, I don't know how we close it. But does that necessarily mean, Sam? Does that necessarily mean that we're going to revert back to the politics and the global imperialism that led to the first two world wars?
No, I don't necessarily think so. There's always black swan events and things that can happen, but I think every large country kind of geared more towards globalism for a while,
yeah,
and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There's a ton of benefits from that.
Yeah.
And I think we're swinging back a little more, maybe to the center of the aisle, per se. I don't think we're going to get back to the full isolationists.
No.
But there's probably, I mean, just like everything, whether it's political or what, it seems like you have this massive pendulum that swings too far to both sides. And hopefully we can kind of settle down and get somewhere in the middle where it's, yeah, we got to protect our own first. There's a ton of benefits to globalism. There's a ton of benefits to trade and working with other countries. I mean, that's the stuff you learn in your first economics class is trade and things of that nature. So there's tons of benefits, but it's finding the right balance and putting what's most important to yourselves first. I think that we're kind of maybe getting back towards a little more.
Well, that's certainly apparently what a lot of people are beginning to think around the world. I will end this with saying that, people coming to your country looking a little bit different and talking a little bit different is not necessarily a bad thing.
Not at all.
Not at all, as long as they want to assimilate to what the culture is and what it means to be French, what it means to be German, what it means to be an American. I'll tell you a perfect example of what immigration has meant to the United States. Sam, I didn't tell you this. I fixed some Mexican lasagna the other night. Corn tortillas, meat and cheese, tomatoes, roasted corn.
No ricotta.
I have a Mexican lasagna, and I had a glass of French wine with it. I mean,
some Colombian coffee in the morning. And
so I mean, probably not a lot of people in Japan eating that. But at the same time, it's kind of fun learning a lot about different cultures and what have you. But it's not fun when there's no economic activity and you're feeling threatened, I guess.
Yep.
All right. Well, guys, thank you all so much for listening. We always love to hear from you all. So if you have any comments or questions, please, by all means, let us know. You can always drop us a line at tradingperspectives@oakworth.com, or you can leave us a review on the podcast outlet of your choice. As always, if you're interested in reading more or hearing more of what we have to say or how we think, you can always go to oakworth.com, OAKWORTH.com. Take a look underneath the Thought Leadership tab and find all kinds of exciting information, including links to previous episodes of Trading Perspectives, links to our newsletter/blog, Common Sense, as well as links to our quarterly magazine, Macro and Market, as well as a whole bunch of other articles by members of our advisory services team, as well as our investment committee. With that, Sam, we're going to give you one last chance to say something super insightful on this hot topic.
that's all I got.
That's all I've got today, too. Y'all take care.